This is a new logo for the Los Angeles Clippers. It's causing a bit of a stir. So today, we're gonna take a look at this new logo, take a stroll through history, looking at legacy Clipper brand design, and even try my own hand at making a new logo myself. So this logo was debuted in 2024. You're gonna see a lot of logos now. As teams do rebrand, they're almost always within a circle. The NBA kind of wants all these logos to tie together and feel like they're a part of a family. The second thing that you're going to see is the city name. The third obviously being the team name. In the case of this identity, they sit sort of on the same level of hierarchy. And the third main component is obviously the actual visual signifier. Once you get into the jerseys and all like the disparate elements of how the brand comes together, there's a lot of different ways that these things start to break apart. They have this red that gets brought in on the outside. They have this light blue, and it's anchored by the navy, which is a primary component of the logo. You have your C element. Within that C, you start to break down maritime elements. It's like a little bit of a compass going on. And then you have the ship, and within that ship, you have your hidden basketball element. Another common thing, so all teams have a directive to integrate a little bit of basketball imagery in a literal way, and the way that they did it is to add the texture around the ship. Historically, the NBA has generally been anchored in very literal basketball imagery. They're really trying to go back into finding a balance of how do you create something that both is anchored in the culture of the place, the culture of the team, the culture around the name, but then bringing in a little bit of that literal basketball imagery to try to find a balance. I am gonna design my own logo, but before we do that, we need to take a look at the logo through time. Started here, 1970 to 71, when they were in Buffalo. Very endemic of mid-century design at the time in general, even going outside of sports. Attributes, I would say flat, literal with the actual silhouette of the buffalo. 71 to 78, retaining the flatness, but you can see that they tried to make it somehow feel, I would say, energetic with the slanted type, while still maintaining some of the visual references from the logo before. It's almost more like a 3M or IBM kind of mark than a sports team. So from 78 to 82, they used this mark when they changed the name to the Clippers. Much loved by the fans. I feel like there's, a lot of kind of like retro love for this. This pennant was developed in 2018, so I think that just the fact that people still want to buy this merch with this mark on it tells you something about how much people have kind of like a latent love for this, even if the team looks different and behaves different from a brand perspective now. So for me, the main elements are the sails, downward facing sails that are very specific to what is the historical Clipper ship. A Clipper ship was an old school, massive sailboat used for the initial global supply chains. One thing I think was smart through the filter of mid-century modern design is the allusion to the basketball. Is it a basketball? Is it a sun? It brings it into the narrative around the logo, but it's a step too abstract, I would say. They had this mark from 82 to 84 while they were still in San Diego. There's some inherent challenges in the way that the initial logo worked, which they eventually walked away from. These sort of like energy lines that are going through the basketball were shooting off the front. They got rid of that. This one is the first one that brings in the actual basketball, which helps to address the challenge of the name. I don't know the history behind the type, but this was very like a distinct piece of type. It's very close to the Lakers type, but obviously, that started while they were still in San Diego, so I think that was a little bit of a happy accident, to be honest. The team moves to Los Angeles, and from 84 to 2010, they used this version. So they had 4 logos from 1970 to 84. Why did this logo stick from 84 to 2010 when they moved to Los Angeles? I mean, to me, the obvious answer is it was just like baked into the zeitgeist at that time. It just felt like something that was a defining visual of the NBA. Teams like the Lakers, the Bulls, the Celtics, those are all kind of like the classic teams that come to mind when you think about sports identities and timelessness. And I think that this logo falls into that category. 2010 to 2015, they did a subtle update. They switched the typeface that spells out Los Angeles. They made some adjustments to the core script of Clippers, which in my opinion still has some readability issues. And they made some subtle adjustments to the basketball. So you can see that the lines here are moving in a different direction as opposed to here. 2010, 2015, you're moving fully into digital design at that point, whereas the 70 to 71, all the way up through 84, those are hand-drawn, cut down into photostat. They had to photograph them with a camera, go through all these photographic processes to actually add color and render the final logo. These are all hand constructed. 2015 to 2018. They're taking the city name out of it in an obvious way. It gets put into this lockup. So the city name is very subtle here. It's really just in this LA, which alludes to that classic LA lockup, you know, like this thing. So here, subtle change, but you have 2018 to 2024. You know, they really didn't do much beyond a tweak to the colors. So they toned down both the red and the blue, added a little bit more black to both of those tones just to make it feel like richer and deeper. And so we just broke this one down, but this is where we are in 2024. So we've been looking at these flat logos, but in order to really understand how they work, you got to look at it on a jersey. Starting in the top left, you can see in the original San Diego Clippers logo, they were trying to go with something that felt a little more endemic of the time, as opposed to the Celtics, who were doing something that felt a little more timeless and more in a varsity style. From here, this is how the logo adapted to the jerseys in that iconic era. And it's interesting, you know, you start to see how you have your logo, but how does that then translate to a pretty like distinct style of lettering that comes out in the jersey. Top right, you can see in the more modern era, they transitioned into just like a pure script. If I wanted to be a real nerd, this is definitely Stahl's script, which is a pretty standard varsity script. It really has no direct visual reference to the logo, but that's intentional, and that's something that you see a lot of teams do in the modern era. That rebrand that happened in 2015, it brought this really bright, vibrant red and blue, which on the black works pretty well, but you can see where that kind of like vibration would potentially cause a problem for, you know, filming the games itself. On the left, this is much deeper, it screams a little less, and on the white jersey, it stays extremely readable. I have a couple physical jerseys here. You get a feel for how these colors were breaking down, how this script comes in only for the jerseys. So as we move into the 2015 era, they were using the word mark from the actual logo and just literally pasting that on the front of the jersey. You have the city jerseys, which you have this black letter type, but then you have the logo in the bottom corner that is anchored in the core identity, and it's used as a support to this thing that's meant as like a more kind of like cultural extension of the brand. That's always the first step in making a new identity. From here, we're gonna take a look at making our own. Ideally, this kind of exercise, you spread this out over as long of a period of time as you can and figure out different narrative ways into the identity. My first thought is this thing just needs to function as a circle. For me, that's kind of like the main parameter of it. But then within that, I mean, you know, it can be anything. After going through where the team's been, I think there's a real opportunity to explore the original San Diego identity. We've done all this work to kind of look at where the team came from, trying to find some reference points. How can that just work in a more modern context? The two ingredients at play, you've got the sails, and we're trying to create some space to make a little bit more of an obvious basketball reference. So for me, it's an easy way to just split it in half. Conveying energy and forward momentum in a logo is not easy, especially something like this, because you're given parameters. You know, usually you don't have too many colors to work with. You don't have a lot of space to work with. These things need to operate at a variety of different scales. They need to be quick. They need to be able to break apart and work in a lot of different places. So I think in theory here, you know, what I'm really trying to do is just map out how does this thing work from a formal standpoint, and what's the positive and negative space. In its most reduced form, you want this thing to work in one color. The color that you add to it is just an additive ingredient. I've got the sails. I've got like a basic framework for how I think the basketball can work alongside that to help carry that upward momentum. I'm building now what that outside container is going to be for the type. One thing that I think is a little bit missed in how some of these Roundel logos are working, there doesn't tend to be a lot of other elements that work in this outside capacity outside of the type. How can we bring in another element that could set the framework for a larger brand system? Kind of like a nice idea of these little like diamond anchor points that are referencing the sails. You can imagine these breaking off and becoming a pattern or becoming a design element for the jerseys. So this, what I'm really just trying to map out is not so much the lettering style, but it's really just trying to think about, okay, how can this type wrap around? And so part of the reason that I wanted those diamond elements in there was to think about something else to help anchor the mark, because usually it's kept a little blank. This is all subject to change based on how this actually works once I'm doing the real typesetting. In all of my brand work, I always start with typography. Brand ideas like this can be a different kind of challenge because it's so dominated by the visual story that you're trying to find. So it sort of forces me to work in a different way than I'm like more naturally inclined to, which is nice. There's no one size fits all way of approaching these things. Could you imagine rebranding the Bulls? Could you imagine changing that bull? Absolutely not. That's what you're aspiring to, in my opinion. The aspiration is not just new, it's to be lasting. Right now, I'm just filling out the type a little bit just to try to get a feel for the balance. Probably needs to be a little bit more angular to tie back to the diamonds and the sails and that sort of look. But like weight-wise, this is starting to feel right. So the first sketch that I'm going to take into Illustrator is the main logo, starting from the inside out. One thing that I'm missing a little bit in how the new logo functions is like a little bit more color contrast. If it becomes too navy dominant, you lose some energy. Thinking about how to select the right typeface for this, one that like immediately comes to mind that I just picked up a bit ago. It's this typeface called Octic, which I got from Future Fonts, which is a really great typeface supplier. I feel like I evangelize for them pretty like endlessly, but it's basically like a Patreon for type almost. I had bought this a while ago. It's engineered, it's got some of the angles, but the straightness of it feels like it has like a nice counterbalance to some of like the roundness of the shape of the overall logo. So something like that. That's not perfect, but it's close to what I'm talking about here. So here, little diamond shapes. I don't know if the scale here is totally right, but something like this. Something to just help kind of like ground the logo on either side. They probably need to be a little bit taller, but it's close. All right, so I feel pretty good about that. I tried to make it so that the exterior navy outline reflects the line work that's happening in here after I was able to finesse that a little bit. The light blue to give a nod to that portion of the color palette, and then you've got your little diamonds. So those feel like a good holding shape, and then you have this white type that sort of knocks out. All right, I think I'm good here. Time to move on to the Jersey script. This book in particular is specifically about the history of graphic design in France, but what I'm looking for is this one reference that pretty much immediately came to mind. A lot of people have seen this, the old vintage Saint Raphael ads. This style, it was developed by a designer named Charles Lupeau, which was also developed into an actual working typeface by someone. It's called Lupeau. So that's a benefit, is that it would actually be a digitized, usable thing for the brand to be able to use moving forward. You know, there's still some pitfalls here that I need to be careful of. Like, I don't want to go too retro with it, so I need to figure out what is a way that this can be updated and used in a dynamic way that is speaking about it in a way that is relevant to sport and not just like a decorative thing. It's very dense and very thick, so I think one thing that I would do is I would also just like make it a little thinner, make it a little more fine. Imagine one of those little diamonds from the logo snaps off and that becomes the basis for the L. So that's the point, is like just trying to figure out how you make these kind of like visual connections between the disparate elements. You know, the digital version is only going to get you so far. One thing that you'll notice in the P in my reference is that it's open, but I would want it to be more closed off, you know? Like I want it to feel a little more like this. Like I want to figure out how to stay with the same sort of energy, but need to retain some readability. Part of the reason that I think this works well is if you put this type in a sport context and you take it out of this kind of like Art Deco, old school liquor advertising, it has a really kind of like interesting aggressive energy that I think it adds a complementary piece to the equation, where you have your round logo that's containing all of these round shapes, but then within those shapes there's these angles. So it's kind of like an interesting balance where then this script is like entirely about this aggressive angular thing. This part is kind of tough, thinking about that connection. I'd have to see how these letters actually connect once I get them into the computer. The S is probably like the toughest form in the way that this type was built out. He really built that for this Saint Raphael lockup, which you can see he emphasizes Raphael, so the Saint was supposed to be a little bit reduced. So I think the S is gonna be something I'm gonna have to take in a totally different direction to make it work. Part of it is like his constraints and the way that he built it out. You can see there's like a little grid and kind of like stayed within this grid in a really specific way, but here we don't have to stick to those rules. It's just, I'm just trying to capture the spirit of it. It's probably gonna require an outline for holding. The color, that's something that you almost always have to do with these jersey logos anyways, because you need to figure out a way to express all the elements of the color palette. People love vintage advertising that looks like this for the same reason that they love the vintage logos that I was talking about, where like they love feeling that human hand. For me, that's also a big balance of what I try to do is I try to not over-engineer the type intentionally. People don't want perfect, people want something that feels real. I feel really good about where we're at. Because I think that the color is actually a little bit more integral to the way that this is gonna work, I'm just gonna go ahead and give myself a red base to work on. So like I said, there's a version of the Lupo script. So that'll be my starting point here, which obviously gets me pretty far in terms of what I was trying to sketch out before. So to get this font working the way I want it to, I have to adjust the spacing, and then two, the biggest thing is just these P's are like too unreadable. For our purposes, we need this thing to be on the front of a jersey, and it just has to be immediate. You need like a 2-second read, if that. You need like a half-second read. It needs to be punchy, it needs to stay clear. That can be solved pretty easily. I need to open it up a little bit because it gets a little chunky. Immediately feels more readable. For consistency's sake, I don't want to be making the same moves twice, so I'm just going to copy that P. Good trick that I learned also from design type graphic master Kimu Meyer, who was a partner at Doubleday when we were working on the Bucks project. A little shear tool on this stuff gives it a little bit of a skew, and it can like help to create like a little bit more of like an interesting shape, because the challenge with doing this stuff on a computer is trying to maintain like a little bit of like a human hand, and Kimu is probably like the best at that. I've never seen someone use the computer and manipulate it the way he can, so definitely learned a lot from him. Don't have to over-engineer it, but I feel like that's pretty close. I could work on these things forever, but I feel good. Let's send them off to print. All right, feel good about it. That like deep navy on the red definitely pops, feels really, really strong. This I feel very good about as well. You know, there's still some work to be done, I would say, in terms of like how it gets applied, how it would appropriately fit on like a jersey or a short or where the seal would live. But as a core lockup element, like all put together, dead center in the middle of the court, I think it would really punch. I mean, think about these as like a package deal. I mean, for me, I think so systematically about the way identities come together. So like if I had these two components, I could build a whole brand world out of this thing in like a week's time. This typeface separating out and becoming kind of like the core basis for how you do your marketing and your messaging. And then, you know, this diamond could break out and become like a little diamond pattern that you build out. This script, not just on a jersey, imagine that on like a hat. It could reverse out into the other elements of the color palette. I'm feeling very good about this as a starting point. Also got to print it up on a shirt just so we could see how it feels in a more kind of like, you know, literal, like tactile way, thinking about this as something that sits on a garment. I feel like I could see people actually wearing this thing. A lot of people will say like, does it pass a t-shirt test? And that's something that I do. Like even while I'm developing things, I'll just build a little like t-shirt mock-up and throw something on it to see if it's working. And I have to say, I feel like this passes a t-shirt test. Thanks for watching. Hope you found this insightful, and let us know in the comments what team you want us to take a look at next.